The most famous, the most iconic serial killer of all time. A name that conjures fear, a name so engulfed by mythology that it is hard to discern fact from fiction. Numerous theories have been advanced, suspects being plucked from the rags of the poor to the riches of the nobility, and in the process the facts have been obscured and the truth lost. The Ripper's landscape, the streets he would have walked, the buildings he would have seen, have all but vanished under redevelopment. We reconstruct the past, return to those grimy streets, and follow the footsteps of Jack the Ripper. You'll see what the witnesses saw, you'll hear what they said.
You'd say anything but your prayers.
Using the original police reports, witness statements and press commentary, and using maps and photographs, even the streets being lit as the murderer would have seen them, we take you as close as possible to the actual events in Whitechapel of 1888. This is the definitive story of Jack the Ripper. The story of Jack the Ripper began in the early hours of the 2nd of April 1888. Emma Elizabeth Smith, a 45-year-old prostitute, staggered into her lodging house. She told her friends that she had been brutally assaulted by 3 men who had followed her from Whitechapel Church.
And they robbed her, and they subjected her to a savage assault. In fact, they thrust a blunt object into her, and then they left her.
Emma Smith told a doctor at the Royal London Hospital she had been assaulted by a group of 3 men at this busy road junction opposite where Taylor's cocoa factory used to stand. Emma Smith said one of her assailants had been no older than 19, an unusually precise age to have given. It's unlikely she was a victim of a lone killer like Jack the Ripper.
But at least one man thought differently. Walter Dew, in later years, would become internationally famous for pursuing the notorious Dr. Crippen across the Atlantic. But in 1888, he was a young policeman recently transferred to the East End. Looking back on the murder in his retirement, Dew declared his opinion that Emma Smith was the first victim of Jack the Ripper.
I think it's unlikely that he started by committing a murder. You don't start with murder, you start with something less. Which over time escalated into his first murder. It's quite a common pattern.
There's kind of a wholesale effort on message boards today to sort of deconstruct the case, almost to the point where there is no Jack the Ripper, and if there's no Jack the Ripper, then there are no Jack the Ripper victims. Emma Smith certainly fits geographically with what one might think of Jack's kill zone.
You had drunken brawls, you had domestic violence, you had street robberies, and so something like an attack on Emma Smith wouldn't have seemed that unusual at the time. Emma Smith was probably a victim of one of the high rip gangs in the area. What is certain about her, though, is that when she was murdered, the police opened a file, which they called the Whitechapel murder file, and by the end of that year, that would have on it the acknowledged victims of Jack the Ripper.
By 1888, London was the largest and wealthiest place on earth, the financial and commercial powerhouse at the heart of the British Empire. But to the east of the city of London was an area of the most extreme poverty imaginable. The American author Jack London called it the abyss, a bottomless pit. For many, that pit had a bottom, and they'd reached it. It was from these people that Jack the Ripper selected his victims. For many people, life wasn't to be enjoyed, it was to be endured, death providing a final and welcome release. Martha Tabram was one among thousands of women struggling to get through life.
Martha Tabram was born Martha White in Southwark in 1849. She had survived the disintegration of her parents' marriage and the death of her father, and had gone into service, the only occupation open to most women at the time. She'd married a man called Henry Tabram, a foreman packer at a warehouse. The pair had 2 children, but had split acrimoniously, probably due to Martha's heavy drinking. For some time, she'd been with a man called Henry Turner. They earned a living by selling trinkets on the street.
But this second relationship ended, and by late July 1888, Martha was living in a common lodging house and eking out a meagre living by selling matches and occasionally prostituting herself.
The one main thing that really seems to unite the victims is the fact they were all forced to leave or kicked out of their family homes, and the main common factor amongst all these women's stories is the fact they were all alcoholics. Unfortunately, you know, forced to lead these very tragic lives and drank because of it.
Monday 6th of August was a bank holiday. That night Martha met up with a friend, Mary Ann Connolly, who seems to have been more commonly known as Pearly Poll. According to Connolly, the two women eventually found themselves drinking in the company of a pair of soldiers, a private and a corporal.
Oh, you're a lovely boy, ain't you?
Bet you know some darkies.
At 11:45 p.m. they separated. Connolly took the corporal into Angel Alley, and Martha took the private into the adjacent George Yard.
Mary Ann Connolly claimed she saw Martha Tabram walking with her soldier up George Yard, though her statement can't be corroborated. The next time anyone is recorded as seeing Martha Tabram, she was dead.
Well, apparently, throughout the night and into the early hours of the morning, the residents of George Yard buildings said they had been disturbed by some noises of unruly behaviour, seemingly emanating from the streets nearby.
Well, nothing's rough area around here. You're always hearing noises, people shouting murder, and that happens all the time. Don't take no notice of it.
At 2 a.m, Police Constable Thomas Barrett, on duty in Wentworth Street, approached a soldier loitering at the corner of George Yard.
Evening, Corporal. Can I ask what you are doing here?
I'm waiting for a chum. He went with a girl.
Of course you are. Move along.
Resident Elizabeth Mahoney passed up and down the stairs of George Yard buildings several times around 1:50 a.m, but saw nothing unusual. At 3:30 a.m, Alfred Crowe, a young cab driver, walked across the first-floor landing of the buildings and was aware of a body. At 4:45 a.m, John Reeves, a waterside labourer, passed along the landing and discovered the body of Martha Tabram lying in a pool of blood. He returned with P.C. Barrett, who noticed that Martha's clothes were disarranged, as though a struggle had taken place, but there were no signs of footprints or a weapon.
She had been dead some 3 hours. Her age was about 36, and the body was very well nourished. The left lung was penetrated in 5 places, and the right lung was penetrated in 2 places. The heart, which was rather fatty, was penetrated in 1 place, and that would be sufficient to cause death. I do not think all the wounds were inflicted by the same instrument. The wounds generally might have been inflicted by a knife, but such an instrument would not have inflicted one of the wounds which went through the chest bone. My opinion was that one of the wounds was inflicted by some kind of dagger, and that all of them were caused during life.
Jack was a paranoid sort of character who would have carried knives around with him, and in all probability he would have carried more than one knife. In 38 of the wounds on Tabram were inflicted with basically what they call a penknife, and one was inflicted with a much longer bladed knife which penetrated right the way through her breast to her breastplate.
The murderer used 2 weapons. One was a knife with quite a small blade, about 4 to 6 inches long, and the other was something like a bayonet. It does point to the fact that the soldier was the murderer.
He didn't get enough satisfaction from actually just stabbing, so he then gets his satisfaction from the rip in her genitals, which was about 3.5 inches in length. From then on, he concentrates on getting his satisfaction from the other victims by mutilating their lower abdomen with similar incision wounds.
Significantly, there were only 1 or 2 stab wounds inflicted on her lower abdomen, which, considering that the Ripper's later predilection seems to have been on primarily abdominal attacks, would seem to rule out Martha Tabram as a certain victim of Jack the Ripper.
It is at least the same kind of weapons. It is a knife, it is a stabbing, it's done with a frenzy, and it is the same kind of victims.
Martha Tabram's inquest ended with a verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown, a phrase that would reoccur with frustrating regularity as 1888 progressed. The murder of Martha Tabram received a fair amount of press coverage, comparisons being made with the brutality of the assault on Emma Smith, the similarity of their professions, and the geographical proximity of their lodgings and where they were murdered.
It was a battle amongst the public to get the latest information on these murders. So we have examples of the first editions coming out and people lining up to get them, so they're selling out within a couple of hours.
The investigation was placed in the hands of Inspector Edmund Reed, and the police came to believe that they had a star witness in Pearlie Poll.
Pearlie Poll came forward a few days later to say that she'd actually been with Martha Turner, but then she seems to have had a sort of change of mind as to whether she wanted to give evidence or even identify the guardsmen they'd been drinking with.
Confident that they would quickly identify Martha's soldier companion, they staged 2 separate identity parades of soldiers.
It's him.
Are you positive?
So?
Pearlie Poll may have just wanted to become a local celebrity. She might have injected herself into the police investigation quite simply because at first she probably thought, well, a few free drinks can become, if you like, a local celebrity. And it's then she sort of had a flash of memory and realised that, in fact, these guardsmen, the cap bands were different to the ones that the 2 that they'd been with were wearing.
Can't you identify anyone?
He ain't here.
This was hugely embarrassing for the police, who concluded that Connolly was not going to be of any help to them.
P.C. Barrett claimed he'd actually seen a soldier outside George Yard Buildings a few hours before Martha Tabram's body had been discovered, and he was initially adamant that he would actually be able to identify this particular soldier. So he was taken to an identification parade at the Tower of London, and he did identify 2 soldiers who he said he could have been the man, but both soldiers had cast iron alibis, and so evidently his memory wasn't as good as he believed it to be.
Emma Smith and Martha Tabram represent early exploratory questions, shall we say, being put forth to the world by Jack. When he next struck, he had a newfound image of what he wanted to do and what he was about.